This is a quick performance instructional video for part number K10143. Inside your kit there will be a large front plate, thin rear plate, water pump brace, and a Gates 38012 smooth pulley. Included are the 6 spacer tubes and 1 machined idler mount. All the appropriate bolts and nuts needed to complete this installation are provided. Step 1 will be to remove the stock tensioner from the water pump on your engine, but first it will be helpful to remove the groove pulley from the tensioner. We will be using this pulley in the next step of the installation on the bracket. Leave the tensioner disassembled for now, and in a later step we will install the provided smooth pulley. Next we will look at the installation diagram and begin assembling your Kwik bracket. We will begin by placing the large 12mm bolt through the rear of the large thin plate. Then we will place one of the 4 longer spacers onto it, followed by the large thick plate and the idler spacer. Install the grooved pulley which we just took off the tensioner and fasten with a 12mm nut. Do not over-tighten or torque this bolt and nut at this time. Step 2 in the installation instructions calls to mount the bracket. I personally like to finish assembly before mounting the bracket to the engine to avoid leaning over the car into the engine bay any more than necessary. Either way, the steps are essentially the same. In this step you will need the second of the long spacers, a 10mm by 80mm bolt, and the water pump brace. Place the bolt through the water pump brace as shown. Place the spacer between the large thick plate and the large thin plate. Then insert the bolt through the entire bracket as shown. In this last step before we mount the bracket to the engine, we will attach the tensioner. You will need 2 10mm by 90mm bolts, the last 2 long spacers, and your tensioner will be removed in step 1. Place the 2 spacers between the front and rear plate where shown and mount the tensioner to the face plate with 90mm bolts through the entire bracket. It will be helpful at this point to place a 10mm nut on the upper bolt we have just placed through the entire bracket to hold the bolt and spacer in place while we install the bracket, but do not tighten this nut at this time. We will now fasten the bracket to the passenger side head where indicated. Tighten the 80mm bolt through the water pump brace and the lower 90mm bolt through the tensioner to finger tight. We will torque all bolts and nuts in a specific procedure in a later step. Now we will install the 2 10mm by 20mm bolts through the water pump brace into the water pump. Step 4 is mounting the compressor. Take 2 10mm by 35mm bolts and place them through the front inner ears of the compressor and slide them through the ears of the bracket faceplate. Have 2 10mm nuts in hand to secure the compressor to the bracket. Next, take 2 10mm by 60mm bolts with the 2 small provided spacers and secure the rear of the compressor. These will likely be tight, but the thin rear plate of the bracket will flex slightly to allow them to fit between the compressor ear and the back side of the rear plate. To finish the tightening process, take hold of the compressor and push up and in. This takes all the slack out of the bracket to minimize any misalignment. Tighten upper head bolt, and while still supporting the compressor, tighten the lower head bolt. Next, tighten the 2 bolts on the water pump brace. Continue holding up and in on the compressor to finish the tightening process. On the compressor, tighten the front 2 bolts and nuts first to ensure optimal alignment. Then tighten the 2 bolts with spacers on the rear plate. Using a 19mm wrench and socket, torque the grooved idler pulley to 50 foot-pounds. Assemble the tensioner by installing the 38012 smooth pulley. But first we need to install the large washer to ensure the pulley does not rub against the tensioner housing. Notice the smooth pulley sticks out in comparison to the grooved pulley. Don't be alarmed at this. Also notice the pulleys touch one another. This will be resolved when the belt is installed and the tensioner is in operating position. Included in your fastener kit is a 1/32 inch shim. Because of the design of this GM tensioner, it can camber under tension or as it wears with time. The shim is not necessary for your installation, but is provided if this issue should arise. For the Kwik AC bracket installed with a stock alternator power steering bracket, a 101 inch belt is suggested. This would be a Gates number K10143. The belt is installed on the forward 6 grooves of the 7-groove compressor pulley. Use the minimum maximum marks on the tensioner to verify it is within operating position.